Hi there, my name is Alex, and this afternoon I'm going to be showing you and explaining to you the proper wheel end play and how to adjust it. First thing I'm going to go over is your specifications, why you would need to adjust your wheel end play. The first would be bearing failure, or you had wheel end play of 1 to 5 thousandths is your acceptable range, so anything more than that, and you're going to want to adjust it. Anytime you adjust it, you're going to want to inspect to why you need an adjustment. Make sure your bearings aren't worn, make sure your races aren't overly worn. Consider your wheel seal. If your wheel seal is leaking, you're going to have to remove it, and in order to reinstall it, you'll have to adjust your wheel end play by tightening your bearings down. I'm going to go over some parts with you, and then we'll go over the procedures. First things first, we're going to go over some components and order of removal. So the first thing you're going to remove is your axle. In order to take your axle off, you're going to remove the bolts from your axle bolts. Once you remove those, you can slide out your floating axle. It's got splines on it to connect in with your gear in your rear end. You pull that off, your nuts will be exposed. There's several different varieties. This one is a double nut. On the double nut, you'll have an outer nut. It's called a jam nut. After your jam nut, you'll have a jam nut locker ring. It's got a little tab that goes into the spindle, and you want to make sure to fold at least 2 of these tabs over on the flats, not the points, of the outer jam nut. You've got your cotter ring, which is also locks into the spindle and stops the adjusting nut from backing off or tightening with this little dimple that fits into any one of those holes. It's important to note that when you are going through the procedure, if these don't quite line up, rather than just assuming you need to move it, first try flipping it over. It's a slight difference from one side to the other, and you may not have to adjust it. After you get those removed, you'll be pulling out your outer bearing. Your outer bearing will slide out after you move your hub, and then you'll pull the hub itself off. Once you pull the hub itself off, you will flip it over and you will see a wheel seal placed inside the hub inner bearing, which is generally slightly larger. So it's important that before you put your wheel seal in, you make sure your inner bearing is already installed, or you will ruin the wheel seal. Inspect your bearings. You don't necessarily need to wipe them off, but you need to check for pitting, discoloration, any signs of rust indicating water got in there. You want to check for excessive play between the cage and the rollers, and also inspect the bearing race as well. Make sure there's no discoloration, pitting, deformities, and there's not too much play in the bearing itself. You'll also want to do the same with the inner bearing. For that, you want to look at your races and drive these out in a manner of ways. They have drivers for them. It's a good idea to use the proper tools to avoid damage to your hub. You want to inspect your hub itself. You want to make sure your race isn't spinning in the hub. You want to make sure there's no cracking or discoloration. Race seats. Okay, so those are the pieces and parts and the why of what you would change your wheel end play for. Now we're going to go over the how. So the first step in installing your bearings is going to be to lubricate your bearings with the same oil that you're using in your hub. Don't ever want to install a bearing dry. It does not take long for the friction to destroy the metal that's in there, so you need a lubricant. Then you're going to install your race. After you install your race using the appropriate race driver, you will install your bearing and do your inner. Once you do your inner, you want to put your wheel seal in using the appropriate seal driver. It's important to use an appropriate seal driver for the appropriate seal because it has a tapered lip that will prevent damage to the wheel seal itself. It's also important to note that there are 2 different types of wheel seals. You have hub mounted and you also have spindle mounted. Continuing with installation, you would then place your hub on your spindle. When you place your hub on your spindle, you'll go ahead and your adjusting nut, you're going to torque it down to 200 foot-pounds. If you torque it down to 200 foot-pounds, you're going to back it off. This is your initial back off. You'll back it off until it's loose, or one full turn. It's also important to note that while you're tightening the adjusting nut, during the initial tightening and during the final torquing, you spin the hub while it's torquing. That will load the bearings and help seat the seal completely on the spindle. Then you're going to do your initial back off, then you'll do your final torque, which is 50 foot-pounds, and then you'll do your final back off. Your final back off for a drive axle is going to be a quarter turn. Your cotter key in, again, making sure it lines up with one of the holes. Again, if it doesn't, just flip it over and see if it will fit that way before adjusting the nut at all. If you have to adjust the nut, going either way, tightening or loosening, then you'll place on your star ring or your retainer ring, and then you'll do your outer nut. Your outer nut you will do to 400 foot-pounds. It's best to have an assistant hold their hand on the socket. Going on from there, you will then inspect your wheel end play. You'll use a dial indicator. Your wheel end play is going to be from 1 to 5 thousandths. Alright, lastly you want to inspect your spindle. That's this part right here. This is your spindle. This is what everything rides on. That's why they call it a floating axle, because the axle actually floats inside this hole. This spindle and the axle housing itself are what actually support the weight of the vehicle. So you want to inspect this for pitting, cracking. Specifically pay attention to where the bearings ride. They slide on all the way and free spin and don't bind. If they bind or anything, it indicates a high spot, and you'll need to take emery cloth and wrap emery cloth where the bearings ride in order to make sure everything is smooth and operating properly. Alright, now that I've explained it to you, I'm going to go ahead and show you what I mean. So I have my hub here, my bearings are put back in, I got my wheel seal on, so now you're just going to slide the hub back over the spindle. You want to make sure you do not run your seal into the end of the spindle. You also want to ensure that you don't bind up your bearing as you set it in the back there. You want to hold your hub up while you get your outer bearing in, so as not to cockeye the seal in there. Pull it off its seat. You're going to need an axle nut socket. It's important to note that you cannot use an impact on these. They're not rated for that kind of torque. So they're generally 3/4 drive. So I've got my 3/4 drive torque wrench here. You'll go ahead and set it to 200 foot-pounds and put your socket on there, sting nut. You'll go ahead and hand thread it on there. To get it started, you'll switch over to your torque wrench, and while you're tightening, as I indicated, you will spin your hub, ensuring that your bearings are not binding and they're getting a good seat. This is where a second helper would come in handy. You'd have them push on the socket so you can push on the pry bar without slipping off the nut. And you want to torque it down until it clicks. Then you'll do your back off. You'll back off one full turn. It's important to note that you do not want to move the hub at this point. Your bearings were loaded and they're seated where they need to be. Then you'll go ahead and readjust your torque setting, 50 foot-pounds. And again, while spinning, you will go down to the 50 foot-pounds. And once you get there, you'll go ahead and line up your keeper ring. And you line the tooth up with the spindle. Again, if it doesn't line up right away, flip it over and it generally will fit right on. Then you'll take your locking tab ring, again with the lock in the spindle, and then your outer nut. Go ahead and thread it on by hand, and then you'll get your torque wrench back out. You'll go ahead and load it to 400 foot-pounds. And then you'll take a dial indicator and check your wheel end play. Remember that you have between 1 and 5 thousand. Thank you. I hope you learned a lot today.